Russian army is going to collapse or it's going to want to stop the fighting. And if the United States continues to support Ukraine and the Europeans continue to support Ukraine, Ukraine will have a great deal of leverage in future negotiations with Russia. Again, because the Russian economy will be hurting and because the Russians will be suffering on the battlefield and because the Americans and the Europeans will be backing Ukraine to the hilt. I
Mhm.
think this is the story that they tell themselves. But it's a remarkably foolish story. The sanctions have not worked as intended. And all this talk about secondary sanctions is a waste of time because the Americans have figured out that secondary sanctions aren't going to work either. Furthermore, if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are in deep trouble because they don't have enough manpower. It's not weaponry. It's manpower now that is their Achilles heel, and there's nothing the West can do to solve the manpower problem. And
Mhm.
furthermore, they're in trouble in terms of weaponry, and there's not much we can do there either. So they're going to lose on the battlefield. And the idea that the Russians are the ones who are suffering enormous casualties and it's not the Ukrainians has it backwards.
Mhm.
It's the Ukrainians, not the Russians, who are suffering greater casualties on the battlefield. And the Russians are, in my opinion, not far away from winning this war.
Mhm.
And if you read the newspapers, even in the West, carefully, and you listen to the accounts of what's going on in the fighting, it's quite clear the Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And then finally, with regard to the Americans, as I said in response to your first question, the Americans are very subtly withdrawing from this conflict and turning responsibility over to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. So the idea that you're going to get a greater contribution from the Americans is, I think, wrongheaded. So
Mhm.
all of these things tell me that the story that I think the European elites and President Zelensky are telling to themselves is basically a fairy tale.
Do you think that politicians such as Friedrich Merz, Ursula von der Leyen, Keir Starmer, all these people who were present yesterday in Washington, are they convinced that they still can win this war against Russia militarily on the battlefield? Or do we see some kind of cynical aspect in this whole arrangement here? How do you analyze this?
I think that they do believe that they can slowly stem the tide, not win right away. They can stem the tide, and then they can inflict massive casualties on the Russians, and they can then begin to turn the tide
Mhm.
and push the Russians back. Now, you may say, how can they possibly believe this given what's actually happening on the battlefield? I think it's important to understand that the Europeans and President Zelensky himself and many other Ukrainians are motivated to tell themselves a happy story because they have been waging this war for over 3 years now. And they have been waging it on the premise that they were ultimately going to win.
Mhm.
For them to admit defeat at this point in time would be extremely difficult to do. Extremely difficult. And I think when leaders are in a situation like that, they look for stories that they can tell themselves that lead to a happy ending. I
Mhm.
think if we can just delay the inevitable, which is losing, some miracle will happen.
Mhm.
You saw this with regard to the Americans in Afghanistan. It
Yeah.
was clear after, I would argue, about 5, 6 years that we were not going to win in Afghanistan. It was certainly clear after 10 years. It took us 20 years to get out of Afghanistan, 20 years, and we lost. And all sorts of people wanted to stay in Afghanistan. And if you ask them, why should we stay in Afghanistan? How are we ultimately going to prevail in Afghanistan? They had no real story, certainly no compelling story, but they just wanted to stay because they didn't want to admit defeat. And they thought maybe there would be a miracle at some point in the future. And by the way, this was true during the Vietnam War as well.
Mhm,
I think
mhm,
we'd still be in Vietnam today if Congress hadn't finally cracked down and told the Nixon administration and then the Ford administration that you have to end this war. But the Ford administration, especially Henry Kissinger, who was his Secretary of State at the time, they did not want to leave Vietnam. They
mhm,
wanted to stay. They wanted to fight. We did not want to lose in Vietnam. And again, I think European leaders today and President Zelensky and his lieutenants do not want to lose. And they're, desperate to find a story as to how they can prevail.
We find ourselves in an absurd situation. On the one hand, we have seen in Alaska some kind of thaw between Trump and Putin, good atmosphere, well mannered conversations. You could even speak of some kind of friendly exchanges. On the other hand, you have Europe, the European Union, one of the closest allies of the United States, building up piles of weapons and in preparation for a war against Russia. As you know, our experts here in Germany, also in Switzerland, say that Russia is planning an attack on NATO. We have to defend ourselves. And on the other hand, we have friendly relationship between the United States and Russia. I mean, how do you explain this absurdity of the whole situation?
Well, you want to remember in his first term in office, between 2017 and 2021, President Trump wanted to have good relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. And the deep state or the blob or the foreign policy establishment, call it whatever you want, in the United States was adamantly opposed to that. Uh, so, what Trump did in his first administration is he fundamentally altered U.S. relations with China. You want
Mhm,
to remember, it was President Trump who abandoned engagement with China and adopted a containment policy.
yeah,
The other policy, again, that he wanted to pursue was to have a rapprochement with Russia and actually to form an alliance with Russia against China. He completely failed. This time, he plans to go back to that issue and actually improve relations with Russia and, in particular, with Putin. The fact is that Trump likes Putin. Putin is his kind of guy. Putin is powerful. He's a first class strategist. And Trump is someone who respects power. He respects powerful people. If you show weakness around Trump, he'll browbeat you. He
mhm,
does not ever fail to take advantage of weakness. But when he's dealing with Trump, when he's dealing with Putin, he's dealing with a powerful actor in the system. And he understands that. And he respects Putin. He wants to have good relations with
mhm,
Putin. So that's really what's going on here.
mhm,
Uh, with regard to the Europeans, the Russophobia in places like Britain has historically been very great. Nothing's changed on that count.
mhm, mhm,
And the Russophobia in Europe since 2014 has been acute, and very little has changed with regard to that. To make matters worse, and this gets to the second issue that you raised, European leaders have to mobilize their publics to support European policy toward Russia and toward Ukraine. And the way you do that is you threat inflate. You paint this picture of a Russian boogeyman, of a Russian
mhm,
threat that has to be dealt with. You tell a story where Ukraine is the first line of defense. And if the Russians take all of Ukraine, as you say they are destined to do, they're then going to take territory in Eastern Europe, and they're eventually going to put their gun sights on Western Europe.
Mm.
This is basically like dealing with the Third Reich. This is like dealing with Adolf Hitler. The Russian army is like the Wehrmacht. And if we don't stop them now, we'll make the fatal mistake that Chamberlain made at Munich in September of 1938. This is the story that the elites tell. Of course, it's fundamentally at odds with the story that Trump is telling, and it's fundamentally at odds with Trump's behavior in Alaska on Friday. There's no question about that. But the Europeans are committed to this narrative. And they're committed to this narrative because threat inflation is so important for them maintaining public support for increased spending on defense and for continuing to get European publics to support the policy towards Ukraine. And this just adds to the Russophobia and leads to the present situation that we're in. If you want, we could talk about the fact that the idea that Russia is bent on conquering all of Ukraine is nonsense.
Mhm.
The idea that it's going to conquer Eastern Europe and threaten the rest of Europe is also nonsense.
But it's very interesting what you're saying. But this argument that we are in a situation like, Chamberlain before the Second World War, this is a notion that powerful people in Germany, also in the publishing field, they cling to, and they say that's exactly the case, and everybody who has a different opinion is an appeaser. So how would you, as a strategist, as a connoisseur of history, what would be your most effective argument against these, appeasement interpreters of today? Where are they wrong?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about the capabilities. Uh, Russia has spent the past 3.5 years trying to expand its foothold in eastern Ukraine, and it has barely conquered any more territory than it had in 2022 in eastern Ukraine. The idea that Russia is this juggernaut and it has this military that's the equivalent of the Wehrmacht and can easily overrun all of Ukraine is belied by the facts. Just look at the performance of the Russian military over the past 3+ years. Does this look like the second coming of the Wehrmacht? Certainly doesn't look like that to me. Second point I'd make to you is that Putin has never once said that he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine. He has never once said that he had any territorial goals in Eastern Europe, much less Western Europe. The third point I'd make on this is that President Putin would be remarkably foolish to try to conquer all of Ukraine, because the western one half of Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate the Russians and
Mm.
would go to enormous lengths to resist a Russian occupation. What's the story here that European leaders are telling? They're saying that Putin is going to conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, and then he's going to integrate it into a greater Russia. This is not going to happen. Putin fully understands that. We live in the age of nationalism. Putin fully understands the power of Ukrainian nationalism. He fully understands that the Ukrainians have fought like wild dogs for 3+ years because they will do anything they can to resist Russian conquest of their territory. This is not going to change when Putin conquers all of Ukraine. Let me make another point on this. When the Germans launched World War II on September 1st, 1939, and went into Poland, and you want to remember, the Germans only conquered the western one half of
Mm.
Poland. They were not going in to conquer all of Poland because the Soviet Union, as a result of the von Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, was going to conquer the eastern one half of Poland. So here you have a situation where the Germans go in for the purpose of conquering, occupying, and taking large parts of Poland and incorporating it into the Third Reich. How many troops do the Germans go into Poland with on September 1st, 1939? The answer is 1.5 million troops. 1.5 million troops. Ukraine, as we all know, is a much, much bigger piece of territory than the western one half of Poland. When the Russians invaded on February 24th, 2022, General Syrski, this is General Syrski, who now heads the Ukrainian forces, has said on the record that the Russians went in with 100,000 troops. I say they went in with 190,000 troops. I use a more conservative estimate than he does. Whether you have 100,000 troops or 190,000 troops, you are not going to conquer all of Ukraine. Just not going to happen. And of course, it did not happen because the Russians were not interested in conquering all of Ukraine. And indeed, that's why they entered into the Istanbul negotiations almost immediately after invading Ukraine, because they had no interest in conquering all of Ukraine, and they did not have the capability. This army, this army doesn't even have 1 million men in Ukraine, and it's not going to have 1 million men in Ukraine. And you'd need well over 1 million men to conquer all of Ukraine. Final point, Roger. If they conquer all of Ukraine, the Russians will be in deep trouble. They will be dealing with a resistance from the Ukrainians that is incredibly difficult to neutralize. Therefore, they will be in no position to invade Eastern Europe, much less Western Europe. So the idea that Russia is this threat to conquer all of Europe, that it's the second coming of the Soviet Union. This is like May 1945, where the Russian army or the Red Army is in Berlin with hundreds of divisions and is poised to head for Dunkirk. It's a ridiculous argument. This is threat inflation of the worst sort, and it's what gets in the way of having a realistic analysis of the situation, and in my opinion, doing what is best for Ukraine. What we're doing now is not what's smart for Ukraine. It's foolish. It's just making a bad situation worse.
Looking back at these 3 years of war from a Russian perspective, has President Putin achieved his goals? Are the initial interests and factors that he wanted to clear with this war, did he achieve that, or was this war, from the Russian point of view, a tragical error?
Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, why did Putin start the war? And in my story, he started the war because he was profoundly committed to making sure that Ukraine did not become a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It's very important to understand that the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States at the time, was interested in making Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the key element in the West strategy was NATO expansion into Ukraine. And from a Russian point of view, that was an existential threat. I understand that many people in the West refuse to believe that line of argument. They do not think that NATO expansion into Ukraine was an existential threat. But what they care, what they think doesn't matter. What matters is what Putin and his lieutenants thought. And they thought, and they continue to think, that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. And they started the war, the Russians started the war on February 24th, 2022, for the purpose of preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. They have been successful in that regard. And furthermore, they worried about Ukraine becoming a serious military threat to Russia. And what has happened is that Ukraine is being turned into a dysfunctional rump state. And
Mhm.
Ukraine in no way will be a threat to Russia moving forward, nor,
Mhm.
as I said, will it be in NATO. So in the end, Putin will have achieved his principal objectives. I think that it's quite clear from what was happening in the run up to the war. This is in December of 2021, January of 2021, and the first half of February 2021, that Putin was doing everything he could to avoid a war. I know
Mhm.
this is not a popular argument in the West, but if you go back and you look at what the Russians were doing, the Russians were trying to avoid a war. And it was the Americans, it's quite remarkable. It was the Americans who had no interest in negotiating with Putin and avoiding this war. The Russians were running around, excuse me, the Americans were running around in December, January, February, right before the war started, saying that the Russians are likely to attack Ukraine. The Americans were making that argument.
Mhm.
Why weren't the Americans trying to prevent a war? Why weren't they going to great lengths to negotiate with the
Mhm.
Russians to avoid this war that they were predicting? I don't know, other than it seems like the Americans welcomed the war because the Americans thought that they could, with sanctions and with the Ukrainian army on the battlefield, bring the Russians to their knees. But the Americans and the West more generally made no effort to accommodate Russia in the run up to the war when people in the West, especially the United States, thought a war was inevitable. Then
Mhm.
the war breaks out. The Russians, very important to emphasize this, the Russians immediately reach out to the Ukrainians and say, let's start negotiating. Let's start negotiating an end to the war. This is right after it starts. And as you well know, those talks begin and end in Istanbul. These are the famous Istanbul negotiations in March 2022, early April 2022. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is why did those negotiations end?
Mhm.
Especially since there was lots of evidence that the two sides, Ukraine and Russia,
Mhm.
were moving toward a peace agreement.
Mhm.
Uh, it's quite clear that those negotiations ended because the United States and the British, in the form of Boris Johnson, told the Ukrainians to walk away from the negotiations. And again, those negotiations looked like they were going to bear fruit. But we, mainly the United States, told them to walk away. We were not interested in a peace deal. We were interested in continuing the war. Uh, but what's happened over time is, of course, the balance of power in that war has shifted, and the Russians are now in the driver's seat.
Underestimation of Russia once again. Before we talk about a possible paradigm shift in the Russian American relationship after Alaska, I have to ask you a question about President Zelensky. I mean, in Switzerland, in Germany, he is the ultimate hero. I mean, the newspapers, the politicians, they have rolled out the red carpet. They say he's like a saint. He's the bravest politician. He is courageous. He defends his country. His policies are without alternative. What's your assessment of President Zelensky? Is he a hero, or is he a failure in regard of the national interest of Ukraine?
Well, the question you want to ask yourself is when all is said and done, what is going to be the end result of Ukraine's policy regarding Russia and Ukraine's policy during this war? And the end result is that Ukraine is going to end up losing a large chunk of its territory, and it's going to be a dysfunctional rump state. Uh, and in my book, that's failure.
Mhm.
Uh, this is not success. The idea that Zelensky has won,